Okay, a little bit about perception now. So feature detection and parallel processing. When processing visual information, neurons in the occipital lobe of the cortex will fire with specificity to certain features. So this is sort of what feature detection theory is. There are just different parts of the brain that are going to only fire when we are looking at certain things. So maybe a smaller part of the cortex is going to fire when we're looking at lines or edges in a specific orientation, or angles in a specific orientation even. So the information is then passed to further parts of the brain for processing after they are picked up by these parts of the cortex. And this is basically what feature detection theory is. So the human brain can't construct representations of it can construct representations of visual stimuli thanks to parallel processing. So parallel processing and feature detection theory, you'll usually hear hand in hand. And it's basically it just says that different parts of the cortex process different aspects of the visual field simultaneously rather than serially. So we know from feature detection theory that different parts of our brain can process different aspects of a certain visual field. So if you're looking at anything, say you're looking at a tree, one part of your brain can process the color of it. Another part is going to process the shape of it. Another is probably going to process the finer detail of it, maybe the texture of the actual tree. And this all happens at once because of parallel processing. So that allows us to sort of integrate and perceive that image in our mind pretty quickly. Okay, so top-down and bottom-up processing. There are two basic types of processing that we all use on a daily basis. So bottom-up processing involves starting your perception with basic sensation. So if you look to the right, that bottom-up processing, taking sensory information and then assembling and integrating it. So basically you're asking, what am I seeing? This type of processing is used more when the individual is unfamiliar with the stimulus and must rely on new information to construct a mental representation. So bottom processing, we're relying a lot on sensation. We're not relying on experience. It's basically most of the information we're getting is from what is in front of us, how we are perceiving that sensation and that stimulus input. That's really what bottom-up processing it is. It's very basic, as opposed to top-down processing, which allows the individual to draw from past experiences to create a representation of a familiar stimulus or situation. So we'll use models that we understand, ideas and algorithms, any kind of expectation, anything from our past that we can use to helpfully interpret the sensory information that we're bringing in. So instead of what am I seeing, you might recognize it. Is that something I've seen before? If you now recognize that as a tree because you've been studying trees for the last 20 years, you are going to perceive it a lot differently than someone who doesn't even know what a tree is, if that person were to exist. You would know what it eats, how long it lives, what climate it likes. So you would just have a very different mental representation of it, thank you to the advanced top-down processing that you have because of your experience with it. But all people use top-down and bottom-up processing, and usually it even occurs simultaneously. Okay, so keeping on perception, we're going to talk about depth perception for a little bit. So binocular depth cues are those that allow us to take advantage of having two eyes. So our depth perception allows us to take 2D images captured by the retina and represent them in 3 dimensions in our mind. Because we do live in a 3-dimensional world, but our eyes take 2-dimensional pictures. So we're technically seeing in 2 dimensions. We just have a lot of stuff going up in our brains that allows us to create this 3D representation in our mind. So most importantly, having 2 eyes allows for binocular cues. And this is what I was talking about before, how we can take advantage of having 2 eyes. So retinal disparity allows the brain to compare images coming from both eyes to provide information about its distance from the viewer. As objects get further, their disparity decreases, and we must rely on binocular cues. So it's only for objects that are pretty close, because the farther you go, the harder it is, since your eyes are only so far apart, the farther you go, the harder it is for either eye to tell that there's a difference, to tell that there actually is a disparity between the two. And if you look at the bottom, you can see a picture of someone holding up their thumb, and it says seen by left eye and seen by right eye. So if you actually take your thumb and you choose something in the distance and you put it up, and you close one eye and you close the other, you can see that your thumb seems like it moves into different positions. But we don't really see that consciously when we have both eyes open, because that's called retinal disparity, and our brain does a very good job of taking care of that and turning it into an image that makes sense to us. And then convergence is the other binocular cue, and the brain measures how greatly the eyes are turned inward to estimate the distance from the face. So it's basically just the actual physical angle of your eyes. So if your eyes are strained and turned inward more, like you're becoming cross-eyed, your brain is going to register that as you looking at something that is extremely close to your face. And the closer that your eyes get to a straight out 90-degree angle, that's a binocular clue that will let your brain know that it is farther out in the vision, in the field of vision. But when things are too far to see, or for some reason you can't use both eyes to see, we also can rely on monocular depth cues. So they depend on information that may only be available to one eye. And just because you have both eyes available does not mean you don't use monocular depth cues. It just means that these cues only depend on information that is available if you were to only use one lens. So there are some of the examples to the left, and I'll go over these to the right. You can also look these up online as well. Some of these are pretty visual, so if you're confused about one, please go on Google, look it up. There are a bunch of really helpful graphics that'll be able to help you out with that. So relative size, we do have over to the left, and that is relative size will change the perceived distance of an object. So larger objects are going to seem closer in the field of vision. So if you look to the left, we see that relative size over here. This cylinder to the left is bigger than the cylinder to the right. So it makes it appear as if this cylinder is closer to us than this one. So that's relative size. Interposition, objects that block other objects are perceived as closer to us. That is also known as occlusion, as you can see over here. A lot of these may just seem like common sense because we're just so used to using them unconsciously. Relative clarity, relative clarity, hazier objects may be seen as more distant than more clearly defined objects. So that does not look like it's on here, but that one is pretty self-explanatory. If you have two objects that are next to each other, the hazier object is just interpreted as more distant when compared to more clearly defined objects. Texture gradient, a change from a coarse, distinct texture, that should be C-O-A-R-S-E, coarse distinct texture to a fine indistinct texture in an image may indicate increasing distance. So you can look over here at this texture gradient. If we have smoother shapes in the front and more indistinct shapes in the back, this texture gradient will make it seem as if we are moving farther away. So relative height, objects that are higher in the visual field are perceived as farther away. Do we have any over here? We don't. But imagine something like you're painting a picture and you're putting a house on a hill. If you put the house on the hill, it's going to be higher because we're trying to, put it on a hill in the background, and we're trying to indicate distance. So relative height, objects that are higher in the visual field are perceived as farther away. Relative motion, objects that are near to us appear to move faster than those farther away from us. If you're on a train, you could see a train close, or you're at a train station, you could see a train passing by. It'll seem really quick. But if you look up at an airplane, it seems like it's going much slower because it's farther away. But in reality, it is absolutely not going slower, of course. Linear perspective, parallel lines seem to converge as distance increases. So we do have that one over here. Linear perspective, we interpret this as a road that is going farther away. It's increasing its distance from the viewer. So we would accept these as parallel lines, even though our field of view, we see that they're converging. So that's linear perspective. That gives us the impression that these are parallel lines that are increasing their distance from the viewer. And then we have light and shadow. Since closer objects seem to reflect more light, the dimmer of the two objects in a field of vision will seem farther. So that's a little bit different than what the cast shadows one up here. This just means that if you have two objects and the lighting is different on them, the one that is brighter will appear to be closer than the dimmer of the two objects. Okay, so a little bit about Gestalt psychology. So Gestalt comes from a German word that I think means grouped or together. So it's a set of principles that govern how humans group individual parts of an image to construct an entire large image. So it's basically just how we group images to make sense, how we group. They could be sometimes ambiguous images to make sense in our mind. So emergence is the first one we're going to talk about, the first principle. So in attempting to identify an object, we first identify its outline, which then allows us to figure out what the object is. So if you cover the top half of this picture, and that's the first thing you look at, you are not going to notice, you're not going to see 4 legs and the lower half of body of a cheetah. If you look at the entire picture, you're going to notice all at once that there is a cheetah in this picture. And then once you realize that there's a cheetah or some sort of animal in this picture, then you can start to see the smaller structures. You can see the head, you can see the 4 legs, you can see its tail, you can see the texture in its skin, but that is not, those smaller features are not, they're not as apparent to us until we identify the entirety of this animal. So that's what emergence is, and that's just another one of those properties that allow us to make sense out of things that have no outline or aren't 100% stable. So we have multistability, and these are ambiguous images that may alternate back and forth between alternative interpretations in our mind. So it's basically seeing 2 things at once. These 2 are more, the more popular images when we talk about multistability. So the left one, you could look at either of those squares as being in the foreground or background. And when you look at it, often if you keep looking long enough, they're going to switch back and forth. And the picture to the right, it looks like 2 people looking at each other. If you're looking as the white in the foreground, or if you're looking the black in the foreground, then it looks like some sort of chalice or a really fancy cup. But these are both good examples of multistability, where you're seeing 2 images, but they're both equally plausible. So your brain pretty much just alternates between interpretations. And the next 5 laws are considered Gestalt laws of grouping. So the law of proximity, objects that are near each other seem to be grouped together. If you look at the bottom right, you see a bunch of lines. You don't really interpret them as individual lines. You interpret them as a bunch of lines that are creating a square, because they're in proximity, so we assume them to be grouped together. The law of continuity, we perceive smooth, continuous lines and forms even when they are broken up in the image. So we can look right over here, this continuity. These curves in this line, these don't necessarily have to be continuous, because they could be broken up by this line right over here, this straight line. So this could just be a series of alternating semicircles, but because of this continuity, the law of continuity, we're going to perceive it as one continuous squiggly line. The law of closure, we perceive things as complete logical entities. So you can see over here to the right, we have this triangle. It's not closed. We can see that it's not an actual closed shape, but we can assume that that is a triangle just because of our perception. We like to perceive things as complete and closed. So we're going to perceive that as a triangle. The law of common fate, objects moving in synchrony are perceived as a group or unit. You can see up here, ducks, for example, any sort of bird, if they're flying in a row, if they're flying in a V, whatever formation, we're going to group them up, and we're going to consider them a unit because they're moving in the same direction. And the law of connectedness, things that are joined or linked are perceived as connected. Don't overthink that one. It's just exactly what it is. If we look at the bottom right, we don't see 6 dots, we see 3 groups of 2. So the reason why we see 3 groups of 2 rather than 6 dots is because this law of connectedness. We're seeing 3 entities instead of 6 because of those lines that are connecting them. Okay, we'll do another review question. So a patient who has just recently lost vision in his right eye and has most likely been relying on which depth cues for perception? So take a minute or two, again, pause the video, please. I will go over it in a couple of seconds. Okay, let's review. So a patient who has just recently lost vision in his right eye has most likely been relying on which depth cues for perception? So we have Roman numeral 1, which is retinal disparity, 2 is interposition, 3 is relative clarity, and 4 is convergence. So the answer is 2. I'm sorry, the answer is B, which is 2 and 3 only. This was just pretty much a basic comprehension question. You just have to just know the definitions of the 4 of these. One, retinal disparity is a binocular cue. So if a patient loses vision in one of their eyes, they are not going to be able to use binocular cues. They'll have to rely completely on monocular cues for visual perception. So retinal disparity is a binocular cue, and 4, Roman numeral 4, which is convergence, is also a binocular cue. So the only ones that they would be able to use are 2 and 3, interposition or occlusion, and relative clarity. So 2 and 3 would be those monocular cues. So the correct answer would be B.